As we start this episode, let's ask ourselves a question. What is the most symbolic item in American football? If you answered the football helmet, you might be right. And we have two guests today. They're going to share some expertise on this subject. Noah Cohen and Timothy B. Brown. Coming up in just a moment to talk about the football helmet and what it does for football.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darin Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darin Hayes of pigskindispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And boy, we have an exciting episode for you tonight. Something special. We're going to talk about some of the equipment of football, the history, and some new ideas on a piece of equipment we're all very familiar with. And joining us tonight are a couple guests. First of all is one we're very familiar with. That's Timothy P. Brown of footballarchaeology.com. Tim, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Thank you, Darin. Glad to be back as always. Get to talk about football stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tim, you approached me not too long ago on an individual that an expert in a field of some person that has talked about some football equipment and some new ideas and bringing up some old ideas that maybe us modern folks like myself weren't quite aware of. And maybe you could explain the relationship and introduce our other guest.
Sure. So, if you're looking at this on screen, you're already seeing Noah Cohen. Noah is a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and does variety of research, some of which is surrounds the issue of football helmets, safety, and kind of imagery and issues along those lines. I'll let him explain that. So I'm not even sure how. If I reached out to you first or you reached out to me, but one way or another, there's some places where our research overlaps. Because I do the history of anything related to football, and so it kind of overlaps some of his interests, and we connected and have had a couple of conversations, and so without further ado, I'll just Noah, if you want to just kind of give a little background on kind of the things that you research, your interests, as it relates to football.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Tim. And thank you, Darin, for having me on. It's a real thrill to be here. I've listened to some of the podcasts and enjoyed very much. And, I may be the one who works at a university and has a fancy degree, but Tim, your research and what you are able to do on footballarchaeology.com is just so incredible. And your publications, I especially love your most recent book, The History of the Football itself. Because one of the things about sports studies, such as it exists in the American university, is, we think a lot about the history and ethics of football, but these things tend to trace themes of power, themes of capitalism. We're not often paying attention to like little details, like how the football came to be the shape it is, and that history is just so fascinating and frankly really important, as we're going to talk about tonight in the context of the football helmet. I think the folks on my side of the ivory curtain or whatever metaphor you want to make really need to be paying more attention to how important things like equipment are for the connection that American fans have to the game of football and to all sports really. But I think also the football helmet is something special, something distinctive. So before we get to that conversation, just as you requested, a little more background on me. I do teach at Washington University in St. Louis. I also got my PhD here about 10 years ago. I came into the English PhD program and quickly realized I wasn't I like reading books, obviously, or I wouldn't have applied, but I wasn't going to do a traditional dissertation. And fortunately, I found an advisor who was open to someone who wanted to study popular culture. So I did a dissertation and then a book about sports fans, based on writing, novels, histories, online writings, just thinking about the role of the sports fan and how we attach ourselves to our favorite teams and how they interconnect with our own personal narratives about family or region or nation, however else we form these bonds. Sort of what I was working for. I was fortunate enough to turn that dissertation into a book. It came out in 2019. It's called We Average Unbeautiful Watchers, Fan Narratives, and the Reading of American Sport. It has to do with football a little bit. Some of the fan narratives that I study are about football, but it's not primarily a football book.
Excuse me, no, if you could, where can folks get a copy of the book as long as you're letting them know about it? I'm sure they'll want to get a
Sure,
copy.
it's on your mega retailer, your Amazon,
Okay.
your Walmart, but it's also available, through bookstore.com or other ways that you can order it through your local bookstore if you're interested in getting a copy. It's from the University of Nebraska Press, which is an academic press. I strive my hardest to make it a publicly accessible book in terms of the style of writing. I'm not sure I entirely succeeded. I'm hoping to succeed much better on this next book project. But yeah, it's out there, and I encourage you to check it out if you're interested. But how did I get to football helmets from a literary studies PhD and a book about sports fans? Well, part of that is autobiographical. I was not allowed to play football as a young boy. I was very small. My mother was worried. But I don't know if because she wouldn't let me, because I never had that experience of getting knocked around on a football field, I became obsessed with football, particularly the helmets. That was something that I especially connected to. I felt like the football helmet, and my connection to the game begins in like the mid to late 80s. So the football helmets, were not what they look like now, if you can see behind me on the video, but pretty close. The plastic shell, the multi-bar face mask. That's sort of the form that I connected with, and so that was a personal passion of mine. I was always following football. But then as I got to be an academic and started thinking critically about, as I said earlier, issues of power, issues of capitalism, issues of, sort of consumerism, I started thinking, why was I so attracted to that helmet? And was my experience, typical? I wouldn't say it's typical necessarily, although there is a large sort of uni community out there, folks who really pay attention to sports uniforms, the helmet among them. But I do think, and part of what I'm arguing in my new project is that there's something fundamental about the modern plastic shell safety helmet that distinguishes it as singularly important in the iconography of football. And so I set out to do a project on that. And I'm fortunate in my field, which is in American studies now, that it's a multidisciplinary field. We're allowed to sort of pull things from all kinds of different realms of scholarship. So I've learned a ton from historians like Tim. I've learned from material culture studies, the people who study objects and how they're consumed in our culture. Obviously, I'm still thinking about fans because I'm thinking about how fans connect with those things. I'm thinking about players too. I've done some interviews for the project. So the idea is for it to become a book. I haven't quite placed it with a publisher yet. I have some options, but I'm still thinking them over. But my hope is that within a few years, it'll be out there and available for anyone to read. The title isn't definitely set yet, but one of the strong contenders is the one you can see on the screen if you're watching on video: Gridiron Icon, the History, Meaning, and Power of Football Helmets. And I'll stop there.
Oh, very, very interesting. That's for sure. Now, Tim, you have done a lot about the helmets, as Noah said, and some of the history of the helmets. Why don't you give us sort of the 25-cent tour on football helmet?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it, fairly brief, but so like when football descended from rugby, there were no helmets. There wasn't at least a perceived need for it. Um, but as the game got more into the mass play in the 1890s, shoulder pads came along, padded pants, and then they started wearing headgear that is more like what a wrestler wears, today. Um, and then even after, and that was kind of the nature of it. 1906, passing game comes along, and then there was kind of a trend to try to get rid of as much equipment as possible to make the players lighter and faster. Um, but and the helmets that they wore were mostly padded canvas, with then tending towards leather. By the mid 20s, you get a helmet that, when we think about a leather helmet, they were pretty much at that stage, by the mid 20s. Leather helmets remain in place till really until the early 60s. But by 1940, Rydell introduced plastic helmets. So that what's behind me is part of their 1940 brochure, introducing plastic helmets to the market. And then those really took off after World War II when plastics were available, and they became the dominant as the 50s progressed, plastic helmets kind of took over, but there was a big movement to keep them out of the game. There were some coaches that, like Notre Dame, Paul Hornung won the Heisman Trophy in 56, I think it was, wearing a leather helmet. So there were some coaches who just thought that plastic helmet was dangerous. So they stuck with leather. The NFL banned them for 1 year, in the late 40s. So there were, efforts like that, but eventually there was just enough of a safety factor, with the plastic that kind of the plastic won out. And by the 60s, pretty much everybody was wearing face masks as well. That took, really until the early 60s, I would say, before face masks were almost, becoming universal, put it that way. So, and then since then, it's really been an evolution and improvement of the functionality of the helmet in terms of, going from the suspension helmet to the padded helmet to then the air pocketed helmets. And it's been a while since I put a helmet on myself, so sometimes I'm not even sure what's inside those things anymore. But so that's kind of like the functional side of the development, and a little bit of just the materials that they're made of. But I didn't talk about kind of helmets as icons, and I guess I'll, maybe let let you talk about that. No, though I think we wanted to talk a little bit about the Guardian. So here I'm saying that helmet is seen as dangerous, and yet everybody wears them.
Yeah.
So
Well, what's interesting to me about the period that you describe when plastics first come in and there's a real contestation about should we allow this, right? That part of the argument against the plastic helmets is the danger they pose to the lower extremity, right? To knees and ankles. Is that correct? Is that based on your research
yeah,
you're
well,
reading?
that was certainly, some of the examples of the danger were, you know, a Harvard quarterback breaking his leg, getting hit by a helmet. I mean, those kinds of things were specific examples that,
Yeah.
led to some of that.
Yeah, that's really interesting because part of what the plastic helmet does really well, obviously, is protect your skull. The CTE research has shown it probably doesn't protect your brain, but it does protect the sort of physical form of your skull. And early football injuries often, sometimes fatally, involved, skull fractures. So it really protects your skull, but it's much worse, obviously, for your for someone's legs because we've probably all of us seen at some time or another in our experience watching football some gruesome highlight of somebody getting hit in the knee with a helmet and the things that can happen in that moment. But yeah, so there's sort of this trade-off happening, and it's not clear cut. And you mentioning Paul Hornung and the leather helmet. One thing that I was gobsmacked to learn on a research trip to Notre Dame is that they went to the plastic helmets with the golden dome, like they still have, and then went back to leather. Paul Hornung wearing a leather helmet was on a return to leather after they had already adopted plastic. I believe Johnny Lujak, who I think won the Heisman in the 40s, won it in a plastic helmet. And then Hornung, who comes after him, is back to wearing leather. And the golden dome look is so iconic. It connects to their campus and all these things. But there was actually a period where they went away from that, which is kind of unfathomable, I think, from a modern perspective. So yeah, it's a much more unsettled period than people think based on the research that I've done too. I mean, we think of these sort of technological developments as following a clear upward path, but there was at mid-century some sort of jerking back and forth about whether this was going to be the way it went. Obviously, it is the way it went, and I think it's not only because of the icon stuff that I'm going to talk about and the decoration, but I think that certainly factored into it.
Yeah, one of the other interesting things that, I've written about it, but it's still easy to forget, is that when players first started wearing face masks, and this is post World War II, there were earlier versions that were more for protecting the eyes and noses, but one of the big complaints was that they protruded so far from the helmet that the face mask seemed to cause injuries.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a while in the 50s where, rather than having what we think of as the bar kind of face mask that protrudes from the helmet, instead they wore these masks, and oftentimes they were clear plastic, And there were several brands, but those rested directly on the cheeks. And so they protected you, and you wouldn't get a broken nose. But it was a different form, and again, primarily because they wanted to protect the other players, and but those were gone by the end of the 50s. So
Yeah. And the history of plastics factors in here too, right? I mean, part of what's going on is the chemical corporations are developing newer and better plastics. But for the early part of the helmets and these different face protections, there's a lot of cracking going on. They're breaking the helmet. One thing that I couldn't believe when I learned is that the reason so many helmets have a stripe down the middle of them is they actually used that stripe to connect the two plastic halves of the helmet. That's why there's a stripe. It has a functional or had a functional purpose in forming the helmet was to, and so then people picked up on the fact that there was this stripe and they started painting it a different color, and that's how we ended up with one of the most iconic and sort of basic modern helmet decorations.
yeah,
Yeah,
well, like Army was one of the first teams to have plastic helmets. And they had the gold helmet with the black stripe, and that's exactly what it was. So
yeah. If I could put it here a little bit, I'm a former football official, so I'm going to look at it from sort of the official and the rule side here a little bit. And I came across that they had an annual survey of football injury research in 2022. And this is a study of football injuries from 1931 to 2021. It's all football injuries, but they have some data on the spinal injuries and head injuries that ended up terminating death. And it's kind of interesting. They took these in spans of almost 10-year periods. So in the first period they really look at in this chart is 1946 to 1955. They had 91 incidents of all levels of football. And they say they're going down to junior high all the way up to professional. 91 injuries in that 10-year span that led to death. In 2016 to 21, it spiked in the 50s and 60s to 128, 155 in those two decades. And in our most recent decade, they looked at what's a 5-year period, 2016 to 2021, there was 14. So, somewhere it's almost has a thing with the face masks coming in, the plastic helmets, but it looks like they spiked up when the plastic helmets came in, the injuries, because players using them as weapons. In the
yeah,
same study, they attributed to some of the lower deaths being by two major things. 1976, by having the rules change a little bit, so they're having spearing as being more of a point of emphasis and being penalized. And then again, NOXI in 1978 had some more regulations on how helmets could be constructed. And they look at those as two major factors. It's sort of the trend to decrease those, but one injury and one death in football is far too many. So I'm glad they're still advancing it and we're looking at that.
yeah. Well, I mean, from my vantage point, I mean, there are I think other contributors. One is that the early plastic helmets went further down on the neck, and they didn't have some of the padding on the bottom. And like we have the nose guards. Now they're largely decorative, but so players would die from it was basically a guillotine effect, that their head would get pushed back and the helmet would strike their spine. And so that was part of the problem. But the other was that because of the protection that was offered, there was just a lot, coaches taught head into the chest, and so the nature of tackling especially, but and blocking a little bit less so, it, you put players into harm's way through the techniques that were taught. Now nobody teaches that anymore, or at least they shouldn't, but that I think had a lot to do with it. I mean, obviously plus improvements in the helmets themselves, but the way that players were taught to tackle and block has changed, and changed for the worse initially and now for the better.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the face mask is how it changes the action at the snap, because suddenly you just launch yourself into that person. Nowadays, guys have their heads up, of course, so there's less spinal injury, but it's still the case, obviously, that the sort of the helmets are clashing on like basically every play in a way that in early football, there was, horrific contact and much more brutal injuries. But the faces, they were breaking noses from time to time, but the faces weren't sort of quite meeting in the same way that they are now. So one of the really interesting things about football safety debates that I hear now is these various people who believe, rightly or wrongly, I think probably wrongly, but believe that rugby is safer, and they say part of the reason is because they don't have helmets, so guys don't lead with their head and face in making contact. Um, and I think there's something to that, but I'm not sure it's better that way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated by the face mask because I think the face mask is almost as important as the helmet shell itself in terms of how it changed the game, because it not only provides safety protecting the face area, but it also just changes the sort of fundamental point of contact for the snapping action.
Yeah. I mean, you look at the old film and I mean, there's, other changes too, like, offensive linemen can extend their arms and block,
Mhm.
now when,
Mhm.
and you couldn't do that until the late 70s. So, so that changes the nature of blocking as well. But, I mean, back in the day, it did crab blocking and body blocking, and, you just, the game was different. Yeah. So it's, um, and, like, I mean, I hear the calls from time to time about changing to a rugby style game, but the minute, little Cody breaks his nose or gets a big scar on his face, mommy's not going to be very happy about that. And she'll put a
Mhm.
helmet back on her little boy. I mean, it's,
But if you just even look at a different sport where they don't use the helmet to punish, hockey, with the late 70s, about the time when they started adding helmets on, and it gradually went, people were grandfathered out and did it. And I think they've seen a lot of less injuries to heads. Of course, they're taking pucks to the head and getting hit by a football and get hit by a puck in the head's two different things. But they're not using them as weapons as our gridiron players are. And I think that's part of it. And Tim, something you said, back when we played, 60s and 70s, we had coaches that taught us, see what you hit. So you had to have your face up. You might, take your face mask into an opponent, but you were never dropping your head down. I think that sort of came in the 90s and early 2000s that really punished it. And you have, severe injuries like the Ryan Shazier injuries of a few years ago, really sort of an awakening, I think, to the NFL to say, hey, we got to stop this, and defenseless receivers and quarterbacks, and no hitting above the shoulders and the head and neck area. So
yeah,
I think that's promoting some of the safety now.
yeah. Well, and the other thing, like, rugby still doesn't allow tackling below the waist, right? So you can tackle between the shoulders and the waist. So, whereas football, it's, yeah, I mean, you can't tackle the head, but otherwise it's open season, right? So it makes it a different game. It's even like the original, back before helmets were around much, the original reason for knee pads was to protect the tackler's head. It wasn't to protect the player's
Mhm.
knees.
Mhm.
So that's one of those things that, has changed, quite a bit now. And now people barely even wear knee pads, the high pants.
Yeah, I'm refreshing my early football history because I'm teaching a football course this semester, and so I just read Oriard on Michael Oriard, a fantastic historian and scholar of early football, um, on Walter Camp, and I hadn't remembered that in I think it's 1888 Camp led the charge among the old rules committee. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton essentially made all the decisions until the early 20th century. Led the charge to allow tackling below the waist and got a lot of criticism for it because people felt the game got more brutal when there was tackling allowed below the waist. But yeah, that was came pretty early to American football. But as Tim said, internationally with rugby, they still don't allow it.
Yeah. Yeah. I just, in preparing for this podcast, I was doing a little bit of Googling and I came across, I'd never heard of it before, but American Sevens Football League. So it's basically tackle football without helmets. And
Yeah.
there's teams all over the country, but I'd never come across them. So I've got to do a little bit of looking into them. Are
Yeah.
you familiar with them? No?
Yeah, I've been looking into lots of different alternate leagues, and I think, and this ties into sort of my argument about the football helmet, which is to say, I think the football helmet at this point, 75 years on into its history, more or less, is so important to the spectator's connection to the game, that we couldn't get rid of it, even if there were a definitive argument for the safety. The Dallas Cowboys star or the Green Bay Packers G or the Michigan winged helmet is so essential to the way that fans connect with the game that I mean, I think I will argue in this book that the helmet is more important to football than the football itself. That essentially the helmet has become the preeminent symbol of football. I mean, for me, it was always the helmets crashing before Monday Night Football. They don't do that anymore because of CTE. They don't want to emphasize that the helmets are crashing into each other. But that was part of my fascination with the helmet. And I really truly believe that even people who don't pay a lot of attention to sports uniforms, when they think of football, they're thinking of their team's football helmet. And then that is so essential. That essentially the primary purpose of the football helmet these days is as a branding device, not as a safety device. Obviously, everybody says the right things about safety being the most important. And if you ask, football helmet aficionados will say, of course, I want the best things for the players. But then they'll turn around and complain. Let's see if I can lean the right way. They'll turn around and complain about the new, and I can't point in the right direction, the new and different holes that all these football helmets have. Because if you came of age like I did in the mid 80s, the football helmet is a smooth shell. It's a blank canvas. You can put any design on it you want. Nowadays, if you look at these helmets, the Golden Dome last night is all punctured by holes. It's no longer the smooth Golden Dome. So I think for the kind of people who do notice the helmets, the safety technology is starting to get in the way of the sort of beauty of the object for them. I don't think that'll affect things. I think safety will win out. But it is interesting to me that because of the way the safety technology has developed, there's a certain segment of fans are starting to get a little bit upset about it. Even better example of this is the Guardian caps, which I know, Tim, you want to talk about. If you believe the NFL statistics, and there are some people who don't, but if you believe the NFL statistics, they're extremely effective at reducing the harm. That for each, if one player wears one, the impact reduction is 10%. If both players at the point of contact are wearing it, the impact reduction is 20%. And according to their statistics, in preseason, in which all players are mandated to wear the Guardian caps, practices that is, the reduction in concussion incidents reporting is something like 52%, which is huge.
Well,
They look terrible. I know that the Guardian Cap company is working on making a sort of better looking one, but part of the way I'm no scientist, but part of the way the thing works, as I understand it, is that the independent panels being independent is important because it helps deflect and sort of defray the contact as it comes in. So how these things will develop and how much the look versus the safety will matter is fascinating to me. I think it's also interesting that they're so big. No matter how they make them look, the helmet itself has got, I mean, from what's behind Tim, they had to bulge out over the ears. That's how thin they were. Nowadays, they're much bigger. And now you're adding a Guardian cap on top. It's even bigger than that. There's beginning to be a kind of a great Gazoo dynamic. That's a really dated reference, but a great Gazoo dynamic with some of these players wearing these helmets, especially the skill position players. You notice it. If they're a running back and a wide receiver and they've got this big, puffy helmet, I think that reduces some of the visual appeal of the game. And I think that visual appeal is really meaningful.
I don't know if you saw that in recent days, they've published pictures on social media what Guardian Cap 2.0 is going to look at, like released in February. And instead of having the small ice cube looking things all over it, so they're sort of symmetrical in size. They have those around the helmet, but there's one big area on your gridiron icon area that's in the example I've seen is a Georgia Tech. It has the big GT, implanted on there. Everything else is gold. It looks much more aerodynamic and much more like a football helmet, except for being the padded look, having the grooves and stuff in it. So maybe they're onto something there. Maybe they're making some advancements.
It does look better than the sock they're pulling over them now, or wherever they're doing the logos on top of the thing. But the very fact that they are pulling the sock over their head with the logos on the side just shows you how important that space is, that sort of iconicity of the side of the helmet. It's essential in a way that, hockey helmets don't have a logo on them, or if they do, it's a corporate sponsor. Baseball helmets until recently well, they have the helmet in the front, but it's not a side profile thing. And basketball, there are no helmets at all. So I really think it's one of the things that makes football distinctive and gives it a real visual appeal.
No, no, no. Why do you think that the Guardian Cap folks and their technology can't get with the Rydell's and the Schutz and some of the other big helmet companies and just incorporate this padding? Because really, what the padding, Tim alluded to it earlier, doesn't know what the inside of a football helmet looks like. Well, it looks like the Guardian Cap on the inside is what it's been in like the last 20 years. Now they put that inside padding on the outside too. And
Yeah.
why can't they incorporate that into the shell of the helmet at the manufacturer level?
I think they probably can. It's just the question of it's just going to get bigger and bigger. I mean, what does happen now is instead of giving you a helmet that the equipment managers help you inflate or deflate to your fit, in the preseason they have reps from the helmet companies. I'm talking about Power 5 schools and NFL teams. They have reps from the helmet companies come and use a laser measurement system to laser measure each player's head, and then they each get a custom foam liner for their helmet. So there's no more sort of adjusting it on the fly. You've just got something that just fits comfortably all the time. In talking to former players for my book project, all of them talk about having a headache for the first 2 weeks of fall practice, like just getting used to having it pressing on your head. Like even if you weren't participating in contact, you still had a headache just from wearing the helmet. Those days are gone. The players don't have to deal with that anymore. It feels great when they put it on. But as to your question about inside versus outside, I think, again, I'm not a scientist, but it seems to me the likely answer is the reason the statistics reflect that it's better with the Guardian Cap is not because there's something special about being it on the outside, really. It's just that the more padding there is, the better, because it absorbs more of the contact and there's less sort of sloshing of your brain inside your skull.
Now, I guess maybe we've heard a little bit. You've talked a little bit about the argument of some folks saying, "Oh, maybe go to rugby without helmets." Why couldn't there be like a hybrid? Why the hard shell? If the padding is what's doing the most protection, why not have more almost like a pilot's cap? The old World War II pilots, not leather, but have it this Guardian material that it's snug to your head. It's got some padding. I wonder if something like that would have merit.
Those exist, and the place that they're worn is flag football. Texas Sevens, their sort of spring football that they play, and other flag exhibitions or games at all levels. Also for women, by the way, because I think it's something like 8 states now have varsity flag football for girls. They do have exactly what you're talking about. Soft shell helmets that there's no face mask. It sort of looks like an old school leather helmet, only it's not made of leather anymore. It's a soft padded helmet. And something that has begun to happen with those is, as you just talked about with the latest adaptation of the Guardian Cap, they're starting to make those soft helmets with display space on the side for logos. So that's really fascinating to me. I mean, I think a certain stripe of football fan will never want to go away from tackle. They would deride, flag football as basketball on grass, and it is, a different looking game. But with the increasing strategic reliance on the passing game at all levels of football, it's not as different as it used to be. That really passing the ball is the winning formula for most teams. Although maybe not last night. There seemed to be a lot of running the ball.
Yeah, sure was.
Last night championship game. So I think it's really interesting to see how flag football develops and how the gender dynamic factors in too, because I think the NFL is hugely championing, if I can say that, the flag game, but only for girls after the age of about 10. So Troy Vincent, there's a whole NFL page about flag football on the NFL's website, and Troy Vincent, who works for the NFL, has this whole thing about how we love flag football and we want everyone to participate in football, and you don't have to be boys, it's not just for boys anymore. And then later on he says, after they reach a certain age, boys will of course move on to tackle football. Only then it's only we're talking high school varsity, that's only for girls. So there is a sort of weird sort of combination of promise, like we're excited to get more people connected to football, but like vague threat in the growing popularity of flag football.
Of course,
And
then they have then they have the best NFL players each year playing flag football now at the end
yes,
of the
in the
year.
Pro Bowl. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Gavin Newsom in California vetoed a bill last year, I think, that would have outlawed tackle football under the age of 12. And so it had passed both houses of the California state legislature, and he got a lot of pressure from a lot of people to veto the bill, and he did. So it'll be interesting to see how that translates. California's population is huge, but there's still a lot of great football recruits come out of there. But now, in addition to Texas and Florida, they're regularly surpassed by states like Georgia and other smaller states just because the cultures are so different with regard to youth football. And that kind of thing, like a bill almost being passed in California that would have banned it under the age of 12, I think is indicative of some of the culture shifts happening.
yeah. I mean, one of the other things about that, the whole idea of switching to a soft shell helmet is that, football has evolved since 1950, knowing that players wear plastic helmets. So there's a lot of rules that would have to be torn apart, dismantled, and modified if we went to a soft shelled game. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but you can't just say, okay, now go out there and play the same old game. That's not going to work.
Well, they did shift in other equipment though, because about 15 years ago, officials we were told that we had to start checking arms and legs and no hard plastic. Remember the old shin pads and everything that were hard plastic, and other than the shoulder pads and the helmet, you can't have anything hard on there. So some of their arm pads and splints, have to be half-inch foam padding on any, casts or anything that an injured player's wearing. So they are softening up everywhere else on it except for the upper body, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
Yeah,
shoulder pads are a fraction of the size they used to be. I was watching highlight clip of the 1992 Rose Bowl, a personal highlight event for me as a Washington Huskies fan, and I couldn't believe how big the shoulder pads were. Like they were out here, and now they're so small. Like the knee pads are gone. Basically, it's like they're wearing biker shorts out there. A lot of the guys. It's interesting. Yeah, the pads too have really changed.
So how about if we shift over to and really kind of jump on the whole iconography, right?
Yeah.
And they're to kind of do again a little bit of a historical perspective on it. Um, the helmets again pretty much appear in 1892 or so is when they start wearing headgear. But they were always just leather or canvas. And then in 1906, once the forward pass comes into play, Carlisle painted their helmets. As far as I know, they were the only teams to do it in 1906. And they did it because they wanted their eligible pass receivers to stand out. They wanted their quarterback to know who to throw the ball to. And so, now, it took a while for the forward pass to catch on, but still, most teams just kept with regular leather. Tufts had a white helmet in 1914. There's other examples. But it's not until like 1921, 22, University of Chicago puts a logo on the back of their helmet. And as far as I know, they were the first ones. Washington in Seattle, they had a logo on the back of their helmets in the mid to late 30s. And then we get, the best known example is, the LA Rams. Fred Gerke, who played for them, paints Rams, logos on the helmets. So it became
He got $1 a piece for those too. The Rams paid him.
Yeah. Which was
And
big
is it
money in
right,
those
Tim?
days.
Is it right, Tim, that it was on leather for only 1 year? Did they switch to plastic the next year? That's what I seem to find.
I don't know that. I'll have to look at some of the images I have to confirm that. But I mean, one of the things that's interesting too is that So as that switch occurs, there was also a demand. So there were teams that were trying that were would in the 50s that would have their receivers wear a different colored helmet than their linemen. And the NFL approved that in like 48. And then, there's high schools and, people at all levels doing that. Um, but so even after the Rams, though, logos didn't really come on for a little while, and it really was late 50s, early 60s, which I think is probably a television play. But at the same time in the mid 50s, the National Photographers Association said, hey, put numbers on the players wherever you can, because it'll be easier to identify them. So that's when all the helmet, numbers, conferences required teams to put, numbers either on their shoulder pads, sleeves, or helmets, and most of them put them on helmets. So so that slowed college adoption of logos, whereas pretty much the NFL had them all, by mid 60s. I think everybody had it, other than the Browns. Um, and so
Can
it
I
was
can I
really,
interject, Tim? Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt. This
yeah.
is my great right. This is my great white whale, and Tim is actually the one who called me on it in one of the articles I wrote. Is definitive proof that Rozelle pressured people to put helmet logos on. There, I can't find it, but I'm sure that's the case because he works for the Rams when Gerke's painting the helmets. He's the one who brings in the TV contract, and all of a sudden, right around that time period, everyone but the Browns, because Paul Brown hates him or something, everyone but the Browns puts a logo on their helmet. So I'm sure that Rozelle had something to do with that, but I can't prove it. I really want to prove it because everyone lauds Rozelle for the TV stuff, and rightly so. I mean that was a sort of paradigm shift in the popularity of the game, in the popularity of like sports in general, because baseball had been on TV since the 40s, but it's really football that becomes the first TV sport. And the helmets are such a huge part of that because, as I think you pointed out in one of your posts, Tim, in the leather helmet days, you couldn't really see what was happening in the middle of the scrum at the line of scrimmage anyway, so it didn't matter what was on their helmet. But with a zoomed in perspective of television, right? Like all of a sudden you've got this beautiful shot of the offensive and defensive lines lined up against each other. You've got the helmet going down the line, the same design repeated. Like it's this visual spectacle that's like so, I mean, here I'm nerding out because I get excited about it, but it's so entices people, right? And I know Rozelle had to have figured that out, but I can't prove it.
I can add to your conspiracy theory because think about this: the L.A. Rams before the Cleveland Browns were the Cleveland Rams. They won the NFL championship, moved to the West Coast. The next year was 1946 AAFC, and the Cleveland Browns are born. So
Mhm.
the Browns sort of replaced the Rams, and there's probably resentment because it was
Yeah.
how many times do you have a champion team move out of the city and move
Mhm.
2,000 miles away? So there you go.
Of course, they were here in St. Louis as a champion and left again too.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's I'll try to figure it out too, but I also hope Tim, who's a
Yeah,
better
I've
researcher,
been
will
looking.
figure it out.
Believe me, I've been looking. I can't seem to find it. So, um, but yeah, so I mean, it's interesting too. I mean, like one of the things you talk about how important the helmet is, the branding purposes, and yet you have teams like Oregon and many others who switch the look of their helmets every other day. Or I mean,
Mhm.
so which is kind of like, to me, I think of consistency in branding as being so
Wow.
critical. And for them, part of their branding is the variation, right? And the creativity that comes
Mhm.
with, some of
Mhm.
those helmets. So it's an interesting, I guess, juxtaposition. Um, but just returning a little bit to that eligible, ineligible thing is,
Mhm.
even, as late as like I can't think of when Bear Bryant passed away, but like in his last seasons, he was still, um, we think of the crimson helmet for Alabama, but if they were playing Mississippi State, Alabama wore white helmets, you know, because he wanted his receivers to uh, to stand out, and by then everybody on the team had to wear the same helmet design. so he couldn't
Mm.
differentiate his receivers. So, there's
Mm.
images out there with Alabama in those white helmets with the numbers on the side.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Interesting.
I think my favorite piece that you uncovered, and again, all credit to you, Tim, for all this work that you've done, which I had never realized. I mentioned earlier the 92 Rose Bowl. I work at Washington University in St. Louis, but I am a Seattle native, so I'm a big fan of the, the University of Washington, the other Washington. And in the 90s, after the whole scandal with Don James because of a stupid Billy Joe Hobart took money from a booster or whatever ridiculousness it was. So Don James retires and his defensive coordinator, Jim Lambright, became the coach of the Washington Huskies. And one of the things that Lambright did to try to sort of make the team his own and sort of distinguish himself from James was to switch the helmets from gold to purple. And I always thought, well, that was a dumb decision. The gold is iconic. And of course, as soon as he was no longer coach, they switched back to gold. But what I didn't realize until Tim dug it up is that part of the reason he did that is because when he was playing at the University of Washington in the 1960s, everyone wore gold except the captains who wore purple. And Jim Lambright was the defensive captain in one of the teams in the 1960s, and so he got to wear the purple helmet. And so getting everybody to wear purple helmets was in fact directly connected to part of what Tim is talking about, which is that, in the early days of helmet decoration, the standard that we have now, where everybody's helmet looks the same, unless you have like merit stickers, right? And then it can look slightly different for Ohio State or whatever. That wasn't assumed either. It wasn't necessarily the case that the design would be uniform across all the helmets. The captains might have different helmets, as Tim's saying, and there's that the example of Army where everyone's wearing gold except the receivers are wearing bright orange. They look totally different. There were, the numbers being a utilitarian purpose. There were a lot of different ideas bouncing about what one could do with helmet design, but ultimately the branding and the consumer appeal is what wins out. And this, I think, is part of the reason Oregon is the way it is because Oregon figured out, we don't have a tradition of national championships to fall back on. We're not Penn State or Notre Dame or Alabama. We don't have our tradition isn't anything anybody really cares about. So our tradition will become innovation, will become changing the helmet and the uniform every week. And the added bonus of that, something that Phil Knight surely realized quite well, is that then you've got more helmets and more jerseys to sell to fans. And since the helmets are so iconic, the Oregon fan getting the particular look that they like, being able to sell 22 different styles of helmets instead of just one for Penn State, I think is, very intentional because that helps the university and Nike make a lot more money.
Yeah, well, the thing about the coach coming in and changing things, that was, I mean, now it's just kind of taken for granted, I guess. But it used to be that if you got a losing program and you need a new coach, that guy needs to be able to bring in new uniforms and including, changing the helmet, changing the decal, because we want to look different because we don't want to look like the old guys. That's why we fired them. So that kind of stuff is I just find really interesting. But yeah, so the other thing that has changed in all of this is that um, the rest of the uniforms have changed as well. So, back in the day, before plastic helmets, teams, two teams might appear on the field both wearing black jerseys. There weren't rules about the colors that you had to wear. And, over time, I mean, the NFL did required the visiting team to wear white in 1957. Before that, a lot of both NFL and college had you had to have contrasting colors. And it was the home team's responsibility to be contrasting because they had extra, they didn't have to bring both sets, with them on the road. Um, but like the NFL or NCAA didn't adopt the white visitor shirt until 1983. Now, everybody was already doing it by then, so they codified the rule, made it official, but everybody was already doing it. I mean, and a lot of that was first put in for TV purposes because if you're in a stadium, you can tell the green shirt from the blue shirt. But if you're watching on a black and white television, you can't tell the difference. So, it was a television and the money is what drove the change in the color of the uniforms. And now, because the uniforms are always different, it's less important for the helmets to be
Mhm.
different. So two teams with white helmets can play and nobody thinks anything of it because
Mhm.
one of them's going to wear a dark jersey and one's wearing a white jersey, right? So, but
I remember it was only a few years ago that UCLA and USC got to play in the contrasting colors again. They had because that's what until '83, until that rule change, that was their thing. They always UCLA wore the cardinal, I guess they would call it, and or sorry, USC wore the cardinal and UCLA wore the powder blue. And then when they for some reason the rules I think loosened like 4 or 5 years ago, and they started being able to do color on color again.
yeah,
Uh,
and I mean they also do the things like in the NFL you got to get a waiver ahead in advance of the game to where
mhm.
the like for the Cowboys always wearing white jerseys, that kind of thing.
Right.
Um, yeah, I mean it's a fascinating thing, and I do need to do a shout out for UCLA. I'm repping them tonight. One of my sons did his master's there, and they're playing Wisconsin tonight. I shouldn't even be saying this because now we're going to screw up which date this podcast gets to run. But anyways, they play Wisconsin tonight, so I'm using reverse psychology because I want the Badgers to win. So
The ancient Big Ten rivals, UCLA,
yes, oh yeah,
Wisconsin.
goes goes back a long way, young man. Yeah,
So,
well, I mean, I just think it's an interesting thing. Just looking at this was the original plastic helmet, behind me,
mhm,
right? And you mentioned the protrusion around the ears. Now, that kind of I think goes back to like the days of the old dog-eared helmets.
mhm,
And then there were some models of the leather helmets that had the protruding ears and others that didn't. So why one brand did that and others didn't, I'm not, it's one of those mysteries of, that
mhm,
we'll
mhm.
never understand. But yeah, I
One
mean that's a lot of space to put a pretty cool logo, right there.
one thing I'm curious about, Tim, and maybe your research you've uncovered this, is it seems to me that in the leather helmet era, by the time that the sporting goods companies were producing lots of different models of leather helmets, so I'm talking, Rawlings and Wilson, and there's several more. They were a lot of companies doing this. Um, there wasn't there weren't logos, but it seemed to me that they were doing decorative things of a
Yeah,
certain kind with the strips of leather. And I
yeah,
wondered, the one helmet that the design on the plastic still looks like it could be strips of leather is that iconic Michigan design with the sort of
yeah,
wings or ears, whatever they are, and then the three stripes. And if you look at their helmets from that era, they had strips of leather like that, and they had the strips.
yeah,
And then if you look at these sporting good catalogs, there are other ones that have the same little ear things that aren't Michigan helmets. So I wonder how much form followed function, or how much I gather the Michigan design came first from Princeton because it was supposed to be tiger stripes or whatever. But I wonder how much that design actually emerged from just what the helmet manufacturers were doing with the various sort of strips of leather on there, and whether you found anything to that
yeah.
effect.
Well, so the the straps preceded. So they put the straps on initially. I think it was just a way to construct the helmet, and they weren't they didn't view them as decorative. Um, the winged helmet shows up in 1930s first year that those are available, and in fact Ohio State wore them before Michigan did.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and that was to add the pad was to add protection to the forehead. So it was a functional issue, but the designers made them in a variety of different ways, and the striping, there were a variety of different striping elements too. But I want to say it was 36, but somewhere in there. Um, Football was still at a point where when leather helmets were were primarily brown, it was easy to people sometimes couldn't tell a helmet from a ball. And
Mm.
there were running backs who would literally take their helmet off and throw it on the ground to simulate a fumble. So then the NCAA required teams to have to paint the straps in contrasting colors so that it couldn't be, so your helmet couldn't look like a ball. And they also basically, since then, you can't wear a uniform that has the same color as the ball. So, that all kind of came in at the same time.
Unless you're the retro Illinois helmet that they wore this year against Michigan.
Yeah.
That was really fascinating.
I
Making
thought that was
cool.
helmet
Those are really cool.
look like leather, and they did a really good job.
Yeah.
I saw some social media video of like the guy who like airbrushed each helmet. This wasn't like the helmet manufacturers just printing it that way. There was like an actual artist who did each one. That's pretty fascinating.
I thought those were great looking helmets.
They were.
They looked really sharp. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if I answered your question with that, but so it's,
Yeah.
that's where the kind of the multicolor helmets came in to distinguish them from the ball. I mean, that was the purpose behind them.
So that sort of ear formation, from your research, you think came first from the helmet manufacturers trying to enhance the forehead protection before it was ever decorative.
Yes, to pad so it was a way to add pads to the forehead, and there was a lot of, they had a belief that they needed to protect the temple, and so the wing often went over the temple.
That's so interesting. That's really fascinating. We're talking about brows. This is how nerdy we are. And earlier you talked about the nose bumper and how that's, mostly decorative. And with most helmets, if I can lean the right way, point the right way, that it is, because there's a bar below where the nose bumper is. But the new Axiom helmets, on a lot of the models, they've gotten rid of that bar. And so the nose bumper has a purpose again. It could be pushed down and literally hit you in the nose. I thought that was really, really interesting, that the sort of helmet technology, the changing shape of football helmets has brought us back around to the place where you need a nose bumper on your helmet. It's not just a place
for a long time, the nose bump. So the initial nose bumpers were plain, and then somewhere along the line, I think it was Rydell, started putting Rydell. Became a way for them.
Yeah, and they got the NFL to agree to do it on all the helmets. It's not the case anymore, but for a long time, yeah.
But so that was one of those things where, it's like an appendix. There's a name for it. I can't remember what it is.
Yeah. The thing about the Axiom helmets without the crossbar, though, is they look really weird. I mean, to anyone who's paying any attention like me, they look really weird. And I think they've had enough complaints from players and maybe fans or others about how they look, that they've now retrofitted them such that you can get a model that does have a crossbar. Because when the Axiom helmets first came out, you could not get an Axiom helmet with a metal bar across the forehead line. It just wasn't possible. You could have the visor or no visor, but you could not have the metal bar. But now this past season was the first season where they've introduced that crossbar again. So that's another way that like we've naturalized the look of the face mask as part of it. And when you remove part of that face mask look, at least to certain people, it looks really strange.
I don't know. We're running kind of late on our time, I think. Noah, is there any other kind of pearls of wisdom that you think we should all know, or that you want to dispense?
No, I mean, I love the conversation. I love to chat with you, Tim and Darin. I'm nerding out over here, so I'm not feeling like I'm dispensing any wisdom necessarily. I'm just enjoying a great talk. So, thank you for having me. I'd love to come back some other time. I don't know if it can get any nerdier or more esoteric than we got tonight, but I'd love to go there because I love talking about this stuff.
No, absolutely. Anytime you're both welcome to come on here, and there is no time limit on helmets. Everybody loves to hear a good helmet story because, like you said, they're the iconic pieces of football. And I want to thank you both as Western Pennsylvania, because Noah, as you've been talking, I'm seeing Penn State helmet behind you, being the pure white behind you. And Tim, you have the one, the Steelers only have their logo on one side of their helmet, so I'm envisioning that helmet behind you as being the Steelers helmet. So we thank you here in Western Pennsylvania.
That's another great helmet story that they were like, we're going to try out the logo logo on just one side of the helmet to save money. And then they're like, we'll just keep it that way.
Yeah.
They just, because they were saving money on trying out the logo, they just stuck with it. And now it's just the way the Steelers helmets look.
And they took the U.S. Steel logo too to put on there. So.
Yeah. I love that too, because you can always tell when a Steelers helmet has been like they've flipped the image if they're facing the wrong way, and you could see the logo.
Yeah, absolutely. So gentlemen, I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your knowledge and sharing your insight on this great piece of Americana, the American football helmet, and for North American football helmet, because Canadians in football wear the same style helmets that we do too. So we appreciate the conversation, and thank you for the great history.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Really, really good to know that you're studying all this, and I, just for other listeners, Noah is teaching a class on American football this semester, and so 25 lucky students, got the chance to join that class. So hopefully they appreciate the course and have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying
and get
it.
good grades too.
I'm really enjoying it, and I'm getting a lot out of it from them as well. I mean, in part because, as I said at the top, I never played tackle football competitively, and I've got varsity football players in my class. So they certainly have knowledge that I don't, to contribute to the class discussion, and it's been really, really enjoyable so far. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, gentlemen.
Very
Thanks.
good. Thank you.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.